The small town of Pine Grove hadn't seen much excitement in years, but that was about to change on a warm spring morning. The local auto repair shop, nestled between old brick buildings on Main Street, had been a cornerstone of the community for over 2 decades. Its owner, a quiet man known simply as Doc to the townspeople, had built his reputation on honest work and fair prices. Doc wasn't just any mechanic, though few knew about his past. Before opening his shop, he'd served 3 tours as a Marine Corps Scout sniper, earning multiple commendations for his precision and patience. Those same qualities now showed in how he meticulously maintained his tools, each one cleaned and perfectly arranged in his custom-built toolbox. The peace of Pine Grove began to shift and a group of bikers started appearing in town. At first, they just passed through, their modified motorcycles breaking the usual quiet with aggressive revving and excessive noise. But soon, they began hanging around, turning the parking lot of the abandoned grocery store into their unofficial meeting spot. These weren't your typical riding enthusiasts, they were troublemakers who seemed to enjoy causing chaos. They'd race through residential areas at night, vandalize properties, and intimidate local business owners. The sheriff's department, understaffed and overwhelmed, struggled to keep them in check. One Wednesday afternoon, while Doc was working on Mrs. Chen's old Volvo, he heard the familiar rumble of approaching motorcycles. This time, it was different, they weren't just passing by. The noise grew louder until 5 bikes pulled into his shop's parking lot, their riders wearing matching leather jackets with a crude logo he didn't recognize. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and sunglasses, swaggered into the shop like he owned it. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "One of our bikes needs some work. You're gonna fix it." Doc wiped his hands on a shop rag and studied the group carefully, noting how they spread out around his workspace. 20 years of civilian life hadn't dulled his tactical awareness. He could tell these men were looking for trouble, not service. "Shop's booked solid for the next 2 weeks, Doc replied calmly, continuing to work on the Volvo's timing belt. "There's another garage about 40 miles south that might be able to help you sooner." The bearded man's face darkened. "Maybe you didn't hear me right. We're not asking." He moved closer, deliberately knocking over a carefully arranged tray of specialized tools. The expensive instruments clattered across the concrete floor, some visibly damaged from the impact. Doc's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served with him in combat. He remembered the long hours of patience in hidden positions, the discipline of waiting for exactly the right moment. Those skills had served him well as a sniper, and they'd serve him well now. The bikers, mistaking his silence for fear, grew bolder. They began picking up his tools, tossing them between themselves like toys, laughing as precision instruments worth thousands of dollars were treated like party favors. One of them opened Doc's main toolbox, whistling at the organized collection inside. "Nice setup you got here," the bearded leader sneered. "Be a shame if something happened to it. Maybe if you're more cooperative about fixing our bikes, we can make sure your stuff stays in good shape." Mrs. Chen, who had been waiting quietly in the office, slipped out the back door unnoticed. She knew Doc well enough to recognize the tension building in the air. As she hurried toward the sheriff's office, she could hear more motorcycles arriving at the shop. Doc carefully finished torquing the bolt he was working on, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He'd faced worse situations in places far more dangerous than his own shop. These men had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to learn a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property, and about judging a book by its cover. The story of what happened next would be told around Pine Grove for years to come. It wasn't going to be a tale of violence, Doc had left that life behind. Instead, it would be a masterclass in strategic thinking, community solidarity, and the kind of justice that comes from playing the long game. The bikers thought they'd found an easy target in a small-town mechanic. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. As the tension in the auto shop reached its peak, Doc's mind was already 3 steps ahead. He remembered his old commanding officer's words, "The best battles are the ones you win before they begin." Those words had saved his life more than once in the service, and they were about to prove just as valuable in civilian life. The bearded leader of the bikers was still tossing Doc's precision torque wrench from hand to hand, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. What he didn't notice was Doc carefully positioning himself between the group and the shop's main circuit breaker panel. He also hadn't spotted the small security cameras Doc had installed after the last break-in attempt 2 years ago, cameras that were now capturing everything. "You boys seem real interested in tools," Doc said, his voice carrying just a hint of amusement. "Must know a lot about mechanics, then." He reached down, seemingly to pick up a fallen screwdriver, but his hand found the master switch instead. In one smooth motion, the entire shop plunged into darkness. The sudden blackout caught the bikers off guard. In the confusion, Doc moved silently through his shop, a space he knew by heart. Years of working in low-light conditions during his service had given him an advantage these troublemakers couldn't match. While they stumbled around cursing, he was already implementing the next phase of his plan. The backup generator kicked in 30 seconds later, but by then, Doc had disappeared. The bikers found themselves alone in the shop, their tough guy act somewhat deflated by their obvious confusion. What they didn't realize was that Doc had slipped into his office through a hidden door, another modification he'd made years ago, just in case. From his office, Doc accessed his computer system. While the bikers had been focused on intimidation, he'd been documenting everything. His high-definition security cameras had captured clear images of their faces, their bikes' license plates, and most importantly, their acts of vandalism and attempted extortion. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen had reached the sheriff's office, but she wasn't the only one raising the alarm. The local community had its own warning system, a network of text messages and phone calls that spread news faster than any official channel. The hardware store owner, the diner manager, and even the high school principal were all spreading the word, Doc needed support. The bikers, still in the shop, were growing increasingly uneasy. Their leader tried to maintain his threatening demeanor, but the situation had slipped out of his control. He couldn't understand why his usual intimidation tactics weren't working on this quiet mechanic. "Come out, old man," he shouted, his voice echoing in the now silent shop. "You're just making things worse for yourself." What happened next would become part of Pine Grove's local legend. The shop's external doors suddenly rolled down with a thunderous crash, their heavy-duty motors activated by Doc's remote system. The bikers found themselves sealed inside, their bikes still parked outside in the lot. Then, the shop speaker system crackled to life. Doc's voice, calm and measured, filled the space. "Gentlemen, let's talk about choices. Right now, you have 2 options. Behind the red toolbox, you'll find cleaning supplies. You can start by picking up the mess you've made, or you can wait for the sheriff to arrive and explain why you're on camera destroying private property." The bearded leader's face reddened with anger. "You think you can trap us in here? We'll tear this place apart." "You could," Doc's voice agreed. "But take a look at your bikes through the windows first." The bikers rushed to the windows, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The parking lot had filled with townspeople, dozens of them. The hardware store owner had parked his truck behind their motorcycles. The high school wrestling coach and his team stood nearby, arms crossed. Even old Mrs. Chen had returned, now accompanied by what looked like half the senior citizens' morning walking group. But what really got their attention was the sight of their bikes. Someone had managed to get close enough to remove all their spark plugs, a job that would have taken an expert mechanic less than 2 minutes. The message was clear, they weren't going anywhere without Doc's help. Inside his office, Doc allowed himself a small smile. He'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies wasn't to match their aggression, it was to show them they'd picked the wrong target. The community's response hadn't surprised him at all. In his 20 years in Pine Grove, he'd fixed cars at discount rates for people who couldn't afford repairs, taught automotive classes at the high school, and helped countless stranded motorists. Now, that goodwill was being repaid. The bikers huddled together, their earlier bravado evaporating as they realized the full extent of their situation. The security cameras were still recording, the doors were still locked, and the crowd outside was growing larger by the minute. Their reputation for intimidation meant nothing against a community united to protect one of their own. Through the speakers, Doc's voice came again, "Those tools you damaged? They're more than just equipment. They're what I use to help people in this town. Every socket, every wrench has helped someone get to work, get their kids to school, or get to the hospital in an emergency. So here's your chance to show this community who you really are. Are you the thugs you've been pretending to be, or are you men who can admit when they've made a mistake?" The shop fell silent as the bikers looked at each other. Their leader's face went through a range of emotions: anger, frustration, and finally, something that looked like resignation. He walked over to the cleaning supplies, picked up a broom, and began sweeping up the tools they'd scattered. Outside, the crowd watched through the windows as, one by one, the other bikers joined their leader in cleaning. Doc had achieved his victory without throwing a single punch, just as he'd planned all along. But the story wasn't over yet. The bikers were about to learn that in Pine Grove, redemption was possible, but it had to be earned. The next hour in Doc's auto shop revealed more than just the true nature of the bikers, it exposed the power of small-town wisdom. As the group cleaned up their mess, Doc watched through his security feed as their body language slowly shifted from defiance to something closer to shame. The bearded leader, who'd been so quick to threaten earlier, now carefully examined each tool before placing it back in its proper spot. Doc decided it was time for the next phase of his plan. He clicked on the intercom once more. Tools don't just need cleaning, they need proper calibration after being dropped. Each one needs to be tested and adjusted. Could take hours to fix everything properly. The leader looked up at the nearest speaker, his expression unreadable behind his beard. "What are you getting at?" "Well," Doc's voice carried a hint of challenge, "since you boys claim to know so much about tools, how about you learn what they're really worth? Not just in dollars, but in what they mean to the people who depend on them." Outside, the crowd had thinned somewhat, but a core group remained, including Mrs. Chen and several other regular customers. They watched with interest as Doc finally emerged from his office, carrying a thick manual and a calibration kit. The atmosphere in the shop shifted as he walked in, his presence commanding respect without demanding it. "First lesson," Doc announced, holding up a torque wrench they'd damaged. "This isn't just for tightening bolts. When I'm working on brake calipers, this tool means the difference between a car stopping safely and a family getting into an accident. Every mark on this gauge matters." The youngest biker, who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped forward with unexpected interest. "That's a snap-on digital torque wrench, isn't it? The one with the angle gauge?" Doc raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You know your tools." The young man shuffled his feet, suddenly self-conscious. "Used to work in my uncle's shop before." He trailed off, glancing at his leader. "Before you found a different crowd?" Doc finished for him. The young man nodded, avoiding eye contact. Over the next 2 hours, something remarkable happened in that shop. What started as a lesson in tool calibration turned into an impromptu masterclass in automotive repair. Doc demonstrated the proper use of each tool, explaining their significance in real-world repairs. The young biker, whose name was Ray, showed a genuine aptitude for the work, asking intelligent questions and absorbing every detail. The bearded leader watched this transformation with growing uncertainty. His tough guy facade cracked further when Doc started talking about the cost of replacing the damaged tools, not in angry demands, but in terms of hours worked, customers served, and lives impacted. "This socket set," Doc explained, holding up a damaged case, "helped me fix Mrs. Chen's car when she couldn't afford the dealer prices. Her grandson needed regular hospital visits, and without reliable transportation, they'd have been in real trouble. Mrs. Chen, still watching from outside, wiped a tear from her eye. The story was true. Doc had fixed her car at cost, even staying late to finish the job. The bikers glanced at her through the window, the reality of their actions finally sinking in. As the afternoon wore on, more stories emerged. The bikers learned about the high school students Doc had mentored, teaching them basic car maintenance so they could find decent jobs. They heard about the late-night emergency repairs for stranded travelers, and the times Doc had helped local farmers keep their equipment running during crucial harvest days. Ray was particularly moved by these stories. "I remember when my uncle's shop was like that," he said quietly. "People counted on him. Not like." He glanced at his leather jacket with its crude gang logo, leaving the thought unfinished. The bearded leader, who'd been silent for a while, finally spoke up. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot here. Way wrong." He pulled out a worn wallet. "We can pay for the damages." Doc shook his head. "Money's not the point. Tools can be replaced. Trust, respect, those are harder to fix once they're broken." "Then what do you want?" the leader asked, a note of genuine confusion in his voice. "Want you to understand what you're really breaking when you go around intimidating people and vandalizing their property. It's not just about the things you damage, it's about the people who depend on those things, on those businesses, on their community." The sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside, and Doc saw another opportunity. He turned to Ray. "You said you used to work in a shop. How'd you like to put those skills to use again? I could use some help around here, especially with calibrating all these tools." Ray's eyes lit up, but he quickly looked at his leader, uncertain. The bearded man surprised everyone by nodding slowly. "Kids wasted with us anyway. Always talking about engines and torque specs instead of raising hell." The sheriff walked in, hand on his holster, but Doc waved him off. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff. These gentlemen were helping me reorganize my tools." In fact, he looked pointedly at the biker leader. "I think they were just about to tell you about some recent vandalism incidents around town. Might help clear up a few unsolved cases." The leader held Doc's gaze for a long moment before nodding. He understood the deal being offered, a chance to make things right, not just here but for all their past misconduct. It wasn't just about avoiding arrest, it was about choosing a better path forward. As the bikers began giving their statements to the sheriff, Doc took Ray aside and started explaining their first project, restoring an old Chevrolet that had been sitting in the back of the shop. The young man's eyes lit up as Doc laid out his plans for teaching him proper restoration techniques. The day that had started with threats and intimidation was ending with an unexpected lesson in redemption. But more than that, it was proving what Doc had learned long ago in the Marines: sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemy, but in turning them into allies. Word spread quickly through Pine Grove about what had happened at Doc's auto shop. By the next morning, the story had taken on almost mythical proportions, with each retelling adding new details. But the truth was more powerful than any embellishment. A potential disaster had been transformed into something unexpected, a chance for change. Ray showed up early for his first day of work, trading his leather jacket for a clean shop uniform. Doc noticed how the young man's shoulders straightened when he put on the uniform, as if shedding a weight he'd been carrying for too long. The other bikers had left town the previous evening, but not before their leader had a final, private conversation with Doc that lasted nearly an hour. "First thing we need to do," Doc said, handing Ray a clipboard, "is inventory all the damaged tools and create a restoration plan." He watched as Ray carefully documented each item, noting the precision in the young man's observations. There was definitely potential there. As they worked, customers began arriving for their scheduled appointments. Many were curious about the new face in the shop, and Doc couldn't help but notice how Ray tensed up each time someone new walked in. He was expecting judgment, maybe even hostility, but that wasn't Pine Grove's way. Mrs. Chen arrived mid-morning to pick up her Volvo. When she saw Ray working on her car, she simply smiled and said, "Young man, after you finish with the timing belt, would you like some of my homemade dumplings? I always bring extra for document." That simple act of kindness hit Ray harder than any confrontation could have. His hands trembled slightly as he finished the job, taking extra care with every step. Doc pretended not to notice the young man wiping his eyes when Mrs. Chen later insisted he take a second helping. Throughout the day, more stories about the bikers emerged. The sheriff's office reported that the gang had come clean about various incidents around town. They'd given information about vandalized mailboxes, damaged street signs, and other misdemeanors. More surprisingly, they'd offered to pay for the damages and perform community service. "Your old boss made quite an impression," the sheriff told Doc during a coffee run. "Said something about learning the difference between being feared and being respected." Doc nodded, remembering their conversation. The biker leader had revealed that he'd served in the military too, though not as a sniper. He'd been a supply sergeant, of all things, before losing his way after discharge. Something about Doc's approach, the tactical thinking, the discipline, the focus on community, had awakened old memories of what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. By afternoon, Ray was deep into learning the shop's organization system. Doc caught him studying the technical manuals during his lunch break, completely absorbed in the detailed diagrams and specifications. When a customer came in with an engine knocking problem, Ray's diagnostic suggestions were spot on. "You've got good instincts," Doc commented as they worked together on the engine. "Just need to polish them up a bit." Ray's face lit up at the praise, but then turned serious. "Why'd you give me this chance? After what we did?" Doc adjusted his work light before responding. "In the Marines, I learned that everyone has a story. Sometimes people just need someone to help them write a better chapter." He paused, checking the timing marks. "Besides, way you handled those tools, even when you were trying to act tough, I could tell you had real respect for the craft." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The high school principal walked in, looking somewhat hesitant. "Doc, got a minute? It's about the automotive program we discussed last month." The school's vocational program had been struggling with budget cuts and lack of qualified instructors. Doc had offered to help, but his schedule was already stretched thin. As he listened to the principal's concerns, he glanced at Ray, who was carefully reassembling an alternator. "What if we had a teaching assistant?" Doc suggested. "Someone who knows their way around engines and could help with the basics while learning advanced skills themselves." Ray looked up, startled, as he realized what Doc was suggesting. The principal followed Doc's gaze, and her expression turned thoughtful. "You mean? Young people often learn better from someone closer to their age," Doc explained. "Someone who understands their challenges, maybe even made some mistakes along the way. Could be valuable experience for everyone involved." The principal wasn't immediately convinced, but agreed to consider the idea. As she left, Ray stood frozen by his workbench, the alternator forgotten in his hands. "You'd trust me to teach kids?" "Trust is earned," Doc replied. "You've made a good start today. Question is, are you ready to keep earning it?" The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of oil changes, brake jobs, and diagnostic tests. Ray absorbed everything like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and showing genuine enthusiasm for learning. When closing time came, he seemed reluctant to leave. "There's something I need to tell you," Ray said as they were cleaning up. "The other guys, they're not coming back to town, but they're talking about making changes too. Leader's thinking about opening his own shop back home, doing things right this time." Doc smiled. Sometimes one person choosing a better path helps others find their way too. As Ray left for the day, Doc noticed him stop to look back at the shop, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. The young man's silhouette in the setting sun reminded Doc of another young Marine he'd known long ago, someone else who'd needed a second chance and made the most of it. That evening, as Doc finished updating his service logs, he reflected on how quickly life could change. Just 24 hours ago, he'd been facing down a gang of troublemakers. Now he was mentoring one of them, possibly helping to reshape young lives through the automotive program, and maybe even inspiring other transformations far beyond Pine Grove. The security cameras that had captured yesterday's confrontation now showed only an empty, peaceful shop, tools all in their proper places. But Doc knew that the real story wasn't about the tools or even the shop itself. It was about the connections that held a community together, and how sometimes the right kind of strength wasn't about overpowering others, but about helping them find their own strength. A week had passed since the confrontation at Doc's auto shop, and Pine Grove was witnessing subtle but significant changes. The morning sun found Ray already at work, dressed in his clean shop uniform, methodically going through the day's appointment list. The transformation in the young man was remarkable. His confidence grew with each successful repair, each satisfied customer. That morning, an old pickup truck limped into the shop, its engine making an ominous knocking sound. The driver, a weathered farmer, eyed Ray suspiciously when Doc assigned him to diagnose the problem. Word had gotten around about Ray's past, and not everyone was quick to embrace change. "I've been coming to Doc for 15 years, the farmer said, arms crossed. Rather have him look at it." Doc was busy with another vehicle but watched the situation unfold. Ray didn't get defensive or angry. Instead, he smiled and said, "Sir, would you mind if I just took a listen? Sometimes fresh ears catch things others might miss." The farmer grudgingly agreed. Ray leaned in, closing his eyes to focus on the engine's rhythm. After a minute, he straightened up. "Timing chains loose. Probably about 3 teeth off. If we don't fix it soon, it could jump and cause serious engine damage." Doc hid his smile as he watched the farmer's expression change from skepticism to surprise. Ray's diagnosis was perfect, exactly what Doc had suspected when he'd heard the truck pull in. But more impressive was how Ray handled the situation, showing respect while proving his worth through knowledge rather than words. By lunchtime, the farmer was telling anyone who'd listen about the young mechanic with the golden ear. It was a small victory, but these moments were adding up. The town was slowly seeing Ray as more than just a reformed troublemaker. The high school principal had also made her decision about the automotive program. After thorough background checks and several long discussions with Doc, she agreed to give Ray a chance as a teaching assistant. The conditions were strict, any hint of trouble would end the arrangement immediately, but it was an opportunity Ray took very seriously. "Never thought I'd be nervous about facing a bunch of high school kids," Ray admitted as he prepared for his first class. He'd spent hours studying the curriculum, determined not to let Doc down. "Just remember," Doc advised, "you're not just teaching them about cars. You're showing them there's always a better path if they're willing to work for it." The class turned out to be a surprise success. The students, initially skeptical of the new assistant teacher, were drawn in by Ray's real-world experience and straightforward teaching style. He didn't sugarcoat the difficulties of the work or his own past mistakes, and that honesty resonated with the teenagers. One student in particular, a quiet girl who'd been struggling with the technical aspects, found her confidence after Ray showed her a simple memory trick for remembering the firing order of different engines. "My uncle taught me that," he explained. "Before I got caught up with the wrong crowd, he was trying to teach me the right way to do things." The mention of his uncle led to an unexpected development. During a break between classes, Ray made a phone call he'd been putting off for years. The conversation was difficult, full of long silences and awkward apologies, but it was a start. Doc pretended to be busy with paperwork, giving Ray privacy while he rebuilt another broken connection. Later that afternoon, an unusual customer pulled into the shop, a police officer from 2 counties over. He'd heard about what had happened with the bikers and had a proposition. His department had several seized motorcycles that needed assessment before auction. Would Doc's shop be interested in the contract? Might need someone who really knows bikes, the officer mentioned, glancing meaningfully at Ray. Doc watched as Ray inspected one of the motorcycles, noting how his expertise shone through as he explained the custom modifications and potential issues. The young man's past experience with bikes, once used for causing trouble, was being transformed into a legitimate business opportunity. But the biggest surprise came in the form of an email from Ray's former gang leader. He'd made good on his word about changing his life, using his VA benefits to enroll in a business management course. He was serious about opening his own shop and wanted Ray's advice about setting up a mentorship program similar to what Doc had created. From troublemakers to job creators, Doc mused as Ray shared the news. Funny how life works sometimes. The day ended with a community council meeting where Doc had been asked to speak about his mentorship program. Ray sat in the back, still uncomfortable with attention but determined to support the initiative. As Doc described their success, other business owners began asking about similar programs for their trades. What happened in my shop last week wasn't just about tools or motorcycles, Doc explained to the council. It was about recognizing that everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story. Sometimes people just need someone to show them how. The council meetings usually ended with polite applause and quick goodbyes, but this time people lingered, discussing possibilities. The hardware store owner talked about hiring at-risk youth. The diner manager mentioned cooking classes for troubled teens. The seeds of change were sprouting in unexpected places. Walking back to the shop under the evening sky, Ray and Doc discussed plans for expanding the training program. The young man's eyes lit up as he described his ideas for combining traditional mechanics with modern diagnostic technology. You know, Ray said, stopping to look at the shop's sign glowing in the twilight, a week ago, I thought being feared meant being respected. Now I understand the difference. Doc nodded, remembering his own journey from Marine sniper to small-town mentor. Respect isn't taken by force, he replied. It's earned through actions, built one day at a time. The security cameras that had captured last week's confrontation now recorded a different scene, mentor and apprentice closing up shop, tools properly stored, the day's work done with pride. The cameras couldn't capture the invisible changes, the strengthening of trust, the growth of confidence, the healing of old wounds. Pine Grove was changing too, becoming more than just another small town. It was becoming a place where second chances weren't just given, but earned. Where past mistakes didn't define future possibilities. Where one act of wisdom and restraint had sparked a chain reaction of positive change. As they locked up for the night, Ray paused. Doc, remember when you said everyone has a story? He smiled. Thanks for helping me start a better chapter. The street lights flickered on, casting long shadows, but the darkness held no threats now. Just the promise of another day, another chance to prove that the strongest transformations often start with the smallest choices. 1 month after the incident that changed Pine Grove, Doc's auto shop had become more than just a place for car repairs. The small waiting room now doubled as an impromptu classroom where Ray taught basic car maintenance to interested community members on Saturday mornings. The free workshops had started as a way to give back to the town, but they'd grown into something much more meaningful. This particular Saturday morning, the shop was buzzing with activity. Ray was showing a group of single mothers how to change their own oil and check vital fluids. His patient explanations and encouraging manner had them feeling confident about handling basic maintenance themselves. My ex-husband used to tell me these things were too complicated for me to understand, one woman said as she successfully completed her first oil change. Now I can show my daughters that they can learn anything if they put their mind to it. Doc watched from his office, taking pride in how Ray handled each question with respect and enthusiasm. The young man's teaching style had a way of making complex mechanical concepts accessible to everyone. But more than that, he was helping people find confidence they didn't know they had. The morning's workshop was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of a familiar face, Ray's uncle, the former shop owner who'd first taught him about cars. The older man stood awkwardly in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Ray froze mid-demonstration, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "Heard about what you're doing here," his uncle said, breaking the tension. Thought maybe you could use some extra tools. Still had your old set in storage." The toolbox he brought in was worn but well-maintained, filled with the basic tools Ray had used during his apprenticeship years ago. But it wasn't just tools inside, there were also old photographs of a teenage Ray working on his first engine rebuild, his face bright with achievement. During the lunch break, uncle and nephew sat together on the bench outside the shop, years of silence melting away as they shared stories and rebuilt their relationship. Doc busied himself with inventory, giving them space while keeping an ear out for the occasional burst of shared laughter. The afternoon brought another surprise visitor, a reporter from the county newspaper. Word had spread about Pine Grove's unique approach to community rehabilitation, and she wanted to write a story about the transformation of both the town and its newest mechanic. "It's not just about fixing cars," Ray explained as she interviewed him. "It's about fixing connections. Every person who comes through that door has a story, has something they're dealing with. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them." The reporter was particularly interested in how the mentorship program had expanded. Several other businesses in town had followed Doc's example, creating opportunities for people looking to turn their lives around. The hardware store had hired 2 former troublemakers who were now running their contractor service department. The diner's cooking program had led to 3 of its students being accepted to culinary school. "But what about the other bikers?" the reporter asked. "The ones who left town that day?" Ray smiled and pulled out his phone, showing her a series of text messages. The gang's former leader had made good on his promise to change. He'd opened a small repair shop in his hometown, focusing on motorcycle maintenance and restoration. He'd even started his own mentorship program, using his experiences to help other veterans struggling to find their place after service. "Sometimes it takes hitting bottom to realize you need to climb up," Ray explained. "But you can't climb alone. You need someone to show you the handholds, to spot you when you slip." As the reporter left, Doc noticed Ray looking thoughtfully at the newly organized tool wall. The young man had spent hours designing a system that made tools accessible even to those with limited mechanical experience. It was a small thing, but it represented everything the shop had come to stand for: breaking down barriers, making knowledge accessible, helping others succeed. That evening, after the last customer had left, Doc and Ray sat in the office reviewing plans for expanding the workshop program. The local community college had expressed interest in partnering with them to offer certified training courses. It was an opportunity to reach even more people, to create more paths forward for those who needed them. "Never thought a bunch of busted tools would lead to all this," Ray mused, looking at the certification proposal. "Still feel bad about that day, but grateful for how it turned out." Doc leaned back in his chair, remembering his own moments of doubt and decision in life. Sometimes the best tools for fixing things aren't the ones in our toolbox. They're the choices we make, the chances we take on others. The security cameras that had once captured a confrontation now regularly recorded moments of triumph, students mastering their first repair, community members helping each other, lives being rebuilt one lesson at a time. The shop had become a place where people came not just to fix their cars, but to find their way forward. As they prepared to close up, a young teenager who'd been hanging around the shop lately, much like Ray once had at his uncle's garage, stopped by. He'd been struggling in school, getting into minor trouble, but had shown a keen interest in mechanics. "Think you could teach me some of this stuff?" he asked hesitantly, looking at the organized workspace with obvious longing. Ray caught Doc's eye, sharing a knowing look. They both recognized the moment for what it was, another chance to pass on not just knowledge, but hope. The cycle of mentorship was continuing, creating new stories of transformation in Pine Grove. First lesson starts Monday after school, Ray told the boy. Bring your patience and your questions. We'll start with the basics and work our way up. As the boy left, his step lighter with excitement, Doc thought about how a single moment of restraint and wisdom had sparked such far-reaching changes. The tools that had been damaged that day had long since been repaired or replaced, but the real repairs, the ones that mattered most, were still ongoing, spreading through the community like ripples in a pond. Pine Grove had become more than just another small town. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, proof that the right kind of strength wasn't about domination or fear, but about lifting others up, about turning past mistakes into future possibilities. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that changed Pine Grove, and autumn was painting the town in warm colors. Doc's auto shop was hosting a special event, the graduation ceremony for their first official mechanics training program. The shop floor had been transformed, with chairs set up between the lifts and a small podium near the tool wall that had started it all. Ray stood nervously adjusting his tie, a far cry from the leather-clad troublemaker who'd first walked into the shop. He was preparing to give a speech as the program's lead instructor, something he'd never imagined doing. The graduating class included 2 of his former gang members who'd returned to town seeking the same second chance he'd found. Still can't believe they're letting me do this, Ray muttered, reviewing his notes one last time. The certifications the students would receive were real, the result of countless hours of work in coordination with the State Board of Technical Education. Doc smiled, remembering his own nervousness before his first public speech years ago. They're not letting you do anything. You earned this, every step of the way. The ceremony brought together an unlikely mix of people. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, beaming with pride. She'd been one of the program's strongest supporters, providing meals for late-night study sessions. The high school principal was there, along with several of Ray's students from the automotive class. Even the sheriff attended, having become a regular advocate for the rehabilitation program. But the most surprising guest was the gruff farmer whose truck Ray had diagnosed months ago. He'd become one of the program's unexpected champions, offering his collection of old farm equipment as training projects for the students. Young folks need to learn by doing, he'd insisted, not just reading books. As people settled into their seats, Doc noticed Ray's uncle quietly slipping in through the side door. The two had slowly rebuilt their relationship over the past months, working together to combine old-school mechanical wisdom with modern diagnostic techniques in the training program. The ceremony began with Doc's brief introduction, but the real moment everyone waited for was Ray's speech. The young man approached the podium, took a deep breath, and began speaking from his heart. 6 months ago, I was part of a group that came into this shop thinking we could take whatever we wanted through intimidation and force. We thought strength meant making others fear you. We couldn't have been more wrong. He paused, looking around at the familiar faces. True strength, I learned, is what I saw in this community. It's in the way Doc chose to teach rather than punish. It's in how Mrs. Chen offered friendship instead of judgment. It's in every person here who decided to believe in second chances. As Ray continued his speech, Doc's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had earlier that week with his old Marine commanding officer. He'd called to share the success of the program, knowing it would resonate with their unit's philosophy of leadership through guidance rather than force. Always knew you'd find a way to keep serving, Doc, his old CO had said. Just didn't expect it would be by turning wrench turners into community builders. The graduates represented a cross-section of Pine Grove's transformation. Besides the 2 former gang members, there was a single mother who'd started in the basic maintenance workshop and discovered a talent for electrical systems. A teenager who'd been on probation had found his calling in engine diagnostics. Each graduate had a story of challenge and change. After the certificates were handed out, Ray announced the program's next phase. They were expanding to include a specialized motorcycle maintenance course. The idea had come from his ongoing correspondence with his former gang leader, whose own shop had become a success story in another town. Sometimes the best way to help yourself is to help others, Ray explained. That's what this shop taught me, and that's what we want to keep teaching others. The ceremony concluded with an unexpected announcement. The State Technical Education Board had recognized their program as a model for community-based rehabilitation through vocational training. Other towns were interested in implementing similar initiatives. During the reception that followed, Doc overheard snippets of conversation that showed just how far things had come. Ray's uncle was discussing plans to reopen his old shop as a satellite training location. The sheriff was talking with the high school principal about expanding the program to include summer workshops for at-risk youth. But the moment that truly captured the day's spirit came when the young teenager who'd been hanging around the shop, now Ray's dedicated apprentice, approached Doc with tears in his eyes. "My dad came today," he said, pointing to a man standing proudly near the tool wall. He said he's proud of me. First time he's ever said that." Doc watched as Ray joined the conversation, naturally falling into his role as mentor. The young man who'd once been part of the problem was now an essential part of the solution, helping another generation find their way. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sun set through the shop windows, Doc and Ray began cleaning up. The tools that had once been scattered in anger now hung precisely on their hooks, maintained with pride and respect. "You know what I realized today?" Ray said, carefully folding the chairs. "When we first came here, we thought we were tough because we could intimidate people. But real toughness, it's more like what you did. Standing your ground without throwing a punch, believing in people when they don't believe in themselves." Doc nodded, thinking about how a potential disaster had become a catalyst for positive change. "In the Marines, we had a saying, the strongest warrior isn't the one who wins every fight, it's the one who makes fighting unnecessary." As they finished cleaning, Ray paused by the front door, looking at his reflection in the window. His shop uniform, now adorned with an instructor's badge, was a far cry from his old leather jacket. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd picked a different shop that day," he mused. "Life's full of turning points," Doc replied. "The trick is recognizing them when they come, and being brave enough to take the better path." The security cameras that had once recorded a confrontation now showed a transformed space, not just in its physical arrangement, but in its purpose. The shop had become more than a place of business or even education. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose to build up rather than tear down. Pine Grove itself had changed, becoming known not as the town that had a problem with bikers, but as the town that had found a better way to handle conflict and create opportunity. The tools that had been damaged in anger had become instruments of transformation, helping to repair not just vehicles, but lives. 1 year had passed since the day a group of bikers had walked into Doc's auto shop looking for trouble and found redemption instead. The shop was hosting a special anniversary gathering, not to remember the confrontation, but to celebrate what had grown from it. The autumn air was crisp as people gathered in the expanded shop space. The building next door had been purchased and renovated to accommodate the growing training program. Where there had once been abandoned retail space, there was now a state-of-the-art classroom and additional repair bays. The wall between the buildings had been opened up, symbolically connecting the old with the new. Ray stood at the entrance, greeting arrivals. He'd recently been named a full partner in the business, his name freshly painted on the shop sign alongside Doc's. The former troublemaker had not only found his path but had helped forge a new one for others. "Never thought I'd see the day," said a familiar voice. Ray turned to find his old gang leader walking up, looking different in business casual attire instead of leather. He'd driven 3 hours to attend, bringing news of his own shop's success and stories of other lives changed. "Your message about second chances spread further than you know," the former leader said, handing Ray a folder. Inside were photos of his own shop's graduation ceremony, showing former gang members in caps and gowns, holding technical certificates. Turns out a lot of us were just waiting for someone to show us a better way. The gathering wasn't just a celebration, it was also the launch of something new. Doc and Ray had worked with the state to create a network of rehabilitation-focused vocational training centers. Pine Grove's model was being adapted in other towns, creating a chain of opportunity that stretched far beyond their small community. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with the catering, setting up a buffet that brought together traditional Chinese dishes with classic American comfort food. Food brings people together, she'd always said, and the mixing of cultures at the buffet table seemed to prove her right. The sheriff, who'd become a regular visitor to the shop, was deep in conversation with law enforcement officials from other counties. They were discussing how the program had helped reduce repeat offenses and given troubled youth a productive path forward. It's not just about teaching them a trade, the sheriff explained. It's about showing them they have value, that their skills can help others instead of causing harm. Doc watched it all from his usual spot near the tool wall, which had become something of a memorial. The damaged tools from that fateful day had been mounted in a display case, not as a reminder of violence, but as a testimony to transformation. Beside each tool was a photo showing how it had been used to teach and build in the program. A group of current students gathered around Ray as he demonstrated a complex diagnostic procedure on a hybrid engine. His teaching style had evolved, combining technical expertise with personal understanding. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to need guidance, and that empathy made him an exceptional instructor. The key to any repair, he told them, is understanding that everything's connected. You can't fix one part without considering how it affects the whole system. Same goes for communities, we're all connected, all part of the same engine. The young apprentice who'd started hanging around the shop a year ago was now helping lead the basic maintenance workshops. He'd found his confidence, his grades had improved, and he'd recently been accepted to a technical college with a full scholarship. Planning to come back and teach here after I graduate, he told Doc proudly. Want to do for others what Ray and you did for me. As the afternoon progressed, more stories of change emerged. The farmer whose truck Ray had diagnosed brought photos of his grandson, now enrolled in the program. Two of the single mothers from the original maintenance workshop had started their own mobile oil change service. The ripples of transformation continued to spread. Ray's uncle, now a regular instructor in the program, had brought something special, the original toolbox he'd given Ray when he first started learning the trade. It would be awarded to a promising student, continuing the cycle of mentorship and growth. Toward the end of the gathering, Doc called everyone's attention for a special announcement. The shop was establishing a scholarship fund, named in honor of his old Marine unit. It would help veterans and at-risk youth pursue vocational training, turning their experiences and challenges into strengths. A year ago, Doc said, a moment of confrontation could have ended in disaster. Instead, it became a beginning. We learned that the strongest tools we have aren't the ones that fix engines, they're the ones that fix lives, patience, understanding, and the willingness to see potential in others. Ray stepped up beside him, adding, we also learned that every person has two tools they carry with them, the ability to destroy and the ability to create. The choice of which one to use, that's what defines us. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the shop windows, the gathering took on the feel of a family reunion. People who might never have crossed paths were sharing stories, offering encouragement, and building connections. The security cameras that had once recorded a potential tragedy now witnessed a community united in purpose. The tools that had been weapons of intimidation had become instruments of instruction. The shop that had been a target had become a beacon. Later, after most guests had left, Doc and Ray stood in the quiet shop. The tools were all in their places, the floors were clean, and the next day's appointments were ready. But the real work, the ongoing work of transformation, would never truly be finished. You know, Ray said, straightening a wrench on the wall, I used to think strength was about having power over others. Now I understand it's about having the power to lift others up. Doc smiled, remembering his own journey from Marine sniper to community mentor. That's the thing about true strength, it multiplies when you share it. Every person you help becomes another source of strength for someone else. As they locked up for the night, the lights of Pine Grove twinkled in the distance. The town had become more than just a dot on the map, it had become a model of how one moment of wisdom could spark endless possibilities for change. The story that had started with a confrontation over tools had become a testament to the tools we all carry within us, the capacity for change, the power of second chances, and the strength that comes from choosing to build rather than break. In the end, the greatest repair job hadn't been on any vehicle, it had been on the human spirit itself, proving that with the right guidance, anyone could rebuild their life, one careful step at a time.